In 1968, in Vietnam's Quang Tri province, 15-year-old Nguyen races through rice paddies carrying a carefully concealed sack of ammunition. As American helicopters circle overhead, the small boy appears to be just an ordinary farmer going about his daily chores. But when night falls, those bullets would be used in attacks against American bases. Nguyen was just one link in the human chain of the Viet Cong, an invisible soldier in an invisible army. The truth that the Pentagon dared admit only years later was this. In Vietnam, more than 500,000 American soldiers, despite all the technological superiority of the world's most powerful army, fought against millions of peasants, each a potential guerrilla. And they lost. Half a century later, 7,000 kilometers away, in Caracas's impoverished district of Petare, 16-year-old Miguel runs through concrete labyrinths. He looks like an ordinary teenager listening to music with headphones, but beneath the headphone cord hides a small radio, and Miguel's eyes constantly scan the streets. He too is part of a chain, a young lookout in an urban guerrilla network. "We learned from the Viet Cong," he says proudly. "They were invisible in the jungle. We are invisible in the city." According to the Pentagon's latest assessments, Venezuela's urban militia force officially consists of 4.5 million people. While this figure may be exaggerated, armed groups called colectivos and organized militia units definitely exist in Caracas's poor neighborhoods, and these groups appear to have learned the most important lessons from the Vietnam War. In the complex street networks of Petare, once luxurious homes have now been abandoned, transformed into a concrete jungle. Here, in the home of a local militia leader, in a room where portraits of Che Guevara and Ho Chi Minh hang side by side on the walls, young people receive basic tactical training. In Vietnam, they said every village is a fortress, explains Commander Garcia, tracing his fingers over a map of Caracas. For us, every neighborhood is a fortress, every building a shelter, every rooftop an observation post. Training documents of Venezuela's Bolivarian militia forces that clearly draw inspiration from the Vietnamese experience. Each neighborhood has its own defense committee. Each defense committee has its own communication network, lookouts, and basic medical equipment. In Vietnam, they used bamboo. We use concrete, says Elena, a 67-year-old former teacher, now a member of the neighborhood defense committee. They had rice fields. We have street labyrinths. But our strategy is the same, to be nowhere and everywhere. In an apartment in northern Petare, Captain Rodriguez explains guerrilla tactics used in Vietnam 50 years ago and now adapted to Caracas's street labyrinths to a group of young militia members. In the center of the room, there's a detailed neighborhood model on a table. The captain places small figures at strategic points. One of the most effective tactics in Vietnam was the B tactic, he explains, rapidly moving the figures. Guerrillas would split into small groups, attack from different directions, then quickly disperse and blend into normal life. The enemy couldn't know where they would strike or who they were striking. The young militia members listen attentively, some taking notes. Among them are university students, taxi drivers, carpenters, ordinary citizens in normal times, urban guerrillas when necessary. "We use the same tactic, but adapted to the urban environment," continues the captain. "Motorcycles, taxis, metro stations, these are the tools of our modern B tactic." An abandoned factory building east of central Caracas has been transformed into a secret militia training center. Like the Cu Chi tunnels thousands of kilometers away in Vietnam, this structure is part of an invisible resistance network. The Cu Chi tunnels were a symbol of the Vietnam War, says Roberto, a former miner, now a trainer for the Bolivarian militia. Americans, despite all their technology, couldn't completely destroy these tunnels. We're applying a similar strategy, but in an urban environment. Beneath the factory, Roberto and his team have built an underground training complex. Narrow corridors, hidden rooms, alternative exit routes, all resembling the tunnel systems once used by the Viet Cong, but made of concrete and steel. In Vietnam, tunnels were used not just for hiding, but also for training, planning, even as hospitals, explains Roberto, illuminating a low-ceilinged room with his flashlight. Our underground complexes serve the same function. A central element of Venezuela's 21st century guerrilla strategy is public participation. In Vietnam, villages, the Viet Cong involved almost the entire population in the resistance. Farmers worked in the fields during the day and transformed into fighters at night. The greatest tactical advantage in Vietnam was that the enemy never knew who was friend or foe, explains a Venezuelan military strategist. We're adopting the same strategy. In Caracas, every taxi driver, every grocer, every student could potentially be a militia member. A simulation of this strategy takes place in an abandoned shopping mall in western Caracas. Abandoned stores have been converted into military training areas. A dozen young people learn how to quickly take positions with civilian clothes and everyday items, and then blend back into ordinary citizens. Americans made a mistake in Vietnam, says the instructor, holding a wooden AK-47 mock-up. They looked at uniforms. But real power lies in invisibility. This strategy of invisibility is part of what Venezuelan commanders call the urban ghost doctrine. Bamboo traps and secret tunnels from Vietnam have been replaced by versions adapted to the urban environment. Beneath Caracas, old metro tunnels and sewer systems are being mapped for use in a potential conflict. On the hills of Petare, secret passages have been built between houses. In each neighborhood, alternative signal systems have been established for use when communications are cut. In Vietnam, guerrillas could communicate over kilometers using hollow bamboo tubes, explains a communications expert. We have modern versions, but the principle is the same. Communication lines that the enemy cannot listen to or cut. At a training camp in southern Caracas, young militia members receive training in physical endurance and basic weapon use. However, most time is spent on psychological warfare. In Vietnam, American soldiers were physically strong but psychologically weak, explains a trainer. Thinking there was an invisible enemy at every corner wore them down. We're applying the same strategy. How much of the Venezuelan government's claims about militias is real, and how much is a perception operation is difficult to know. However, U.S. Southern Command secret assessments note that Venezuela's urban warfare preparations are remarkable. In Vietnam, external powers armed the peasants, explains a defense analyst. In Venezuela, the government itself is arming the people. This is tactically a very different situation. In a neighborhood in eastern Caracas, dozens of civilians gather in a park before dawn every Sunday morning. Among them are mothers, teachers, taxi drivers, students. All receive basic military training, movement tactics, basic first aid, communication techniques. In Vietnam, every peasant was a soldier, says the instructor. Our philosophy is the same. Every citizen is a defender. The most important point where Venezuela's militia structure diverges from the Vietnam model is technology. Smartphones, satellite communications, drones, none of these were available in Vietnam in the 1960s. We're using technology against our enemy, says a communications expert. In Vietnam, they drew maps with bamboo and chalk. We use GPS and encrypted messaging, but the principles haven't changed. A dispersed, decentralized, network-based resistance. Venezuela's militia system is used not only against potential external threats, but also for internal security. This raises concerns among some human rights organizations. The guerrilla structure in Vietnam was designed against foreign invaders, says a human rights activist. In Venezuela, the same structure can also be used to suppress opposition. This is a concerning difference. Despite these concerns, many residents in Caracas's poor neighborhoods see the militia structure as a guarantee of their security. No one dares attack us here, says a 45-year-old mother living in Petare, because they know there's an eye at every window, a defender at every door. Venezuela's militia structure particularly emphasizes the important role of women. In Vietnam, too, female guerrillas played important roles, and Venezuela continues this tradition. In Vietnam, women played vital roles both as fighters and logistical support, says Carmen, a 50-year-old female militia commander. It's the same with us. Women typically don't arouse suspicion, so they're very effective in intelligence and communication tasks. At a training center in northern Caracas, an all-female militia unit receives training in urban warfare tactics. Most of these women are mothers who come to training after dropping their children off at school. We're here to protect our children and our homes, says Maria, a mother of two. In Vietnam, women fought to protect their families. Our motivation is the same. Venezuela's militia strategy is seen by some military experts as an unrealistic fantasy, while others believe it constitutes a serious deterrent. What America lost in Vietnam wasn't actually the war, but the will to fight, explains a military historian. The American public didn't support a prolonged struggle against an invisible enemy. Venezuela's strategy aims for a similar psychological effect. At a military base in southern Caracas, the Venezuelan army regularly conducts joint exercises with militia units. This resembles the triple junction strategy in Vietnam, coordination between regular army, regional forces, and guerrilla units. In Vietnam, guerrillas never fought alone, says Colonel Martinez, the officer directing the exercise. They were part of a broader strategy. Our approach is the same. Militias complement the conventional army. In these joint exercises, militias typically specialize in reconnaissance, intelligence gathering, and sabotage missions. The army provides training in heavy weapons and open-area operations. In Vietnam, guerrillas provided the regular army with advantages in place and time, explains the colonel. We want to create the same dynamic here. Venezuelan Defense Minister Vladimir Padrino Lopez explicitly stated this in a speech. Our people's army operates with the same philosophy that defeated the American army in Vietnam, a prolonged people's war. The enemy always checks his watch, but we have time. This concept of time is perhaps the most important element of Venezuela's militia strategy. As in Vietnam, the goal is not quick victory, but a prolonged resistance that will erode the enemy's will. The war in Vietnam lasted 8 years, says a strategist. Americans always thought they were near the light at the end of the tunnel, but the tunnel only went deeper. In Venezuela's militia training, this psychological resilience is especially emphasized. Militia members are constantly reminded that a potential conflict would be long-lasting and require patience. As the guerrillas in Vietnam would say, Americans may have the watches, but we have the time, relates an instructor. We embrace the same philosophy, learning to have the same patience. A militia trainer looking out at the city from the hills of Caracas smiles as he shares his final words. There's a saying in Vietnam, water erodes the millstone. We are millions of water drops, and we are patient. This patience and determination form the essential spirit of Venezuela's militia structure. Perhaps the most important lesson taken from Vietnam's people's war model is this. Not numerical or technological superiority, but will and resilience are decisive. On the northern hills of Caracas, one late afternoon, Ramon, an elderly militia trainer, tells young militia members legendary stories from the Vietnam War. Young people sitting around him listen to the tactics of the Viet Cong's famous commander, Vo Nguyen Giap, the philosophy of Ho Chi Minh, and the construction of the Su Chi tunnels. In Vietnam, guerrillas sometimes conducted operations for days without eating or sleeping, says Ramon, himself a former guerrilla. Transcending physical limits is a matter of mental discipline. When your body says I can't, your mind must say I must. This mental resilience training is an important part of Venezuela's militia program. They teach young people not just how to use weapons, but also how to resist hunger, thirst, sleeplessness, and fear. In Vietnam, guerrillas sometimes fought without shoes, in torn clothes, with the simplest weapons, continues Ramon, but mentally, they were always ready. We create similar challenges here, so the comforts of the modern world don't weaken us. As part of the training, young militia members sometimes learn to move in urban environments for 48 hours, without sleep, with minimal food and water. These endurance exercises are directly inspired by guerrilla training in Vietnam. In Vietnam, guerrillas would walk for days with a handful of rice, says an instructor. We're also teaching our militias to fight even in the harshest conditions, without expecting luxury or seeking comfort. The purpose of this challenging training is not just physical endurance, but also psychological resistance. In the Vietnam War, American soldiers were generally accustomed to comfort and lost morale in harsh conditions. Americans wanted hamburgers, cold beer, and air conditioning, explains Ramon. The Vietnamese made do with a handful of rice and a few sips of water. This determined who could endure longer. In a neighborhood in southern Caracas, militia units are developing urban agriculture projects with local people. Vegetable gardens are being created on apartment rooftops, empty lots, and park edges. In Vietnam, guerrillas grew their own food, says Maria, the militia leader managing the project. Logistical dependency is a weakness. A community that can produce its own food is more resistant to external threats. These urban agriculture projects are seen not just as preparation for a potential crisis, but also as a social tool that strengthens community solidarity. In Vietnam, villagers supported guerrillas by sharing their food, says Maria. We want to create the same spirit of solidarity in our neighborhoods. Another notable element in Venezuela's urban guerrilla strategy is awareness programs directed at children and youth. There was a similar approach in Vietnam. The philosophy and practical aspects of resistance were taught from an early age. In Vietnam, children became part of the resistance from a young age, says an education expert. They carried messages, served as lookouts, sometimes set simple traps. In the modern world, we're preparing young people in similar ways. In Caracas's schools, some teachers unofficially give lessons about Vietnam's people's resistance under the name of patriotism education. Students are recommended Ho Chi Minh's writings, Vietnam War documentaries, and books about guerrilla tactics. Vietnam's lesson is universal, says a teacher. Even against a powerful enemy, it's possible to win with unity and determination. This is a lesson our youth should know. This education is met with concern by some parents and education experts. Criticisms are made that children are being militarized and directed toward violence. Vietnam was a different time, a different place, says an educational psychologist. Preparing children for war means stealing their childhood. However, militia leaders defend this education as defensive, not instilling aggression. In Vietnam, children learn to protect their homes and families, says a militia commander. We're teaching our youth the same thing: defense, solidarity, resistance. This defensive doctrine is the foundation of Venezuela's military strategy. As in Vietnam, the goal is never direct confrontation, but wearing down and eroding the enemy. In Vietnam, the strategic principle was simple, says a military theorist. Don't fight where the enemy is strong, strike where he is weak. Retreat when the enemy advances, harass when he stops, follow when he retreats. Caracas's complex street structure provides an ideal environment for this strategy. Narrow streets, tall buildings, complex passages all minimize the advantages of conventional military forces. In Vietnam, forests and mountains provided advantages to guerrillas, says an urban warfare expert. In Caracas, buildings are our forests, metro tunnels are caves, rooftops are hills. Although this urban terrain is very different from Vietnam's forests, it offers similar tactical advantages: invisibility, ease of movement, superior local knowledge. In Vietnam, an American soldier could never fully understand his surroundings, says a militia trainer. It will be the same in Caracas. Which streets are dead ends? Which buildings have secret passages? Which rooftops are safe? Only locals know these things. To reinforce this terrain knowledge advantage, militia units are creating detailed maps of every neighborhood in Caracas, identifying alternative movement routes, marking strategic points. In Vietnam, every guerrilla knew their operational area like the palm of their hand, says a mapping specialist. Our militias should know their neighborhoods the same way: every corner, every entrance, every exit. In an internet cafe in central Caracas, young computer experts are creating 3D urban models, digitalizing building plans, updating maps with drone images. In Vietnam, maps were drawn by hand, says a technology expert. We're using modern tools, but the purpose is the same: to know the terrain perfectly and turn this knowledge into a tactical advantage. This use of technology is one point where Venezuela's urban guerrilla strategy diverges from the Vietnam model. Smartphones, GPS, drones, cyber capabilities. All these modern tools are transforming and strengthening classic guerrilla tactics. Vietnam had message carriers, says a cybersecurity expert. Today, there are encrypted messaging apps, anonymous networks, and digital privacy tools. Technology has changed, but the message is the same: remain invisible. This technological adaptation is particularly popular among young militia members. A hacker community in Caracas is developing secure communication tools specifically for militia operations. In Vietnam, they used bamboo and rope, says a 20-year-old software developer. We use code and algorithms, but the purpose is the same: to create a network the enemy cannot see, hear, or obstruct. Another notable element in Venezuela's militia structure is the use of art as a propaganda tool. In Vietnam, too, art was an important part of the resistance movement. In Vietnam, songs, poems, murals, all nourished the spirit of resistance, says a cultural theorist. We're adopting the same approach, from rap music to graffiti, street theater to digital art. On Caracas's walls, Vietnam-themed graffiti can be seen. Portraits of Ho Chi Minh, famous Vietnamese slogans, drawings of the Cu Chi tunnels. Local musicians compose songs inspired by the Vietnamese resistance. Art is not just aesthetic, it's also the spirit of resistance, says a graffiti artist. In Vietnam, folk songs kept morale high. Our graffiti, music, and films serve the same function. This cultural dimension is an important part of Venezuela's militia strategy. As in Vietnam, the aim is not just physical resistance, but also to display a cultural and psychological stance. In Vietnam, resistance was sustained not just with weapons, but with songs, stories, faith, says a cultural researcher. We see the same cultural resilience in Caracas. A militia trainer looking out at the city from the hills of Caracas points to the city lights as he shares his final words. There's a saying in Vietnam: water erodes the millstone. We are millions of water drops, and we are patient. Over time, we can erode even the strongest millstone. This patience and determination are perhaps the greatest legacy Vietnam left to Venezuela. Despite technological superiority, numerical advantage, and economic power, the ultimate victory usually belongs to the most determined and patient side. Vietnam proved this. Venezuela is reviving the same lesson, this time in a version transferred from forests to the concrete labyrinths of Caracas.